The fracturing of the Galactic Council began slowly at first, with quiet conversations in private chambers and encrypted messages sent between representatives who had decided that survival mattered more than unified political appearance. Within 2 weeks of Malthus sharing Kira's suggestion, 17 species had formally withdrawn from Council membership and announced their intention to negotiate directly with humanity on terms that acknowledged past wrongs and promised genuine change. Councillor Vethrak watched his coalition crumble, with mounting fury that he could no longer contain behind diplomatic language. Traitors, he screamed at the emergency session where 3 more species announced their departure. You abandon everything we built together for the promise of help from a species that cannot be trusted, and should never have been welcomed into our civilization in the first place. But his words fell on ears that had grown deaf to his rhetoric. The representatives leaving the council had seen their world suffer, their people die, and their futures collapse because of decisions that Vethrak had championed with such confidence only months before. They no longer cared about his opinion or his warnings. They cared about survival, and humanity had offered them a path to it. The first human ships returned to Council space on a morning that would be remembered in history as the beginning of a new era. They came not as conquerors or saviors, but as partners responding to formal invitations from species who had accepted the terms that Kira Sujin had outlined aboard the distant station. Engineers arrived at failing power plants with equipment and knowledge that had been denied to struggling populations for too long. Doctors returned to medical stations carrying medicines that could finally be synthesized again by hands that understood the complex processes involved. Mediators stepped between warring factions and began the slow work of rebuilding trust that had been shattered when the first human peacekeepers departed. But everything was different now in ways that even the most optimistic observers had not anticipated. Every contract between humans and their partner species was written down in clear language that specified exactly what was expected from both sides. Every human worker had the explicit right to leave their position without penalty if they felt disrespected or taken for granted. Every contribution made by human engineers, scientists, diplomats, and laborers was recorded and acknowledged publicly so that no one could ever again pretend that human work did not matter. The species who had accepted these terms found that their relationship with humanity became stronger and more productive than it had ever been before the exile. Trust that had been impossible under the old system grew naturally when both sides knew exactly what was expected and what would happen if those expectations were not met. But not everyone benefited from the new arrangement. The species who had sided with Vethrak and refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing found themselves isolated from the assistance that could have saved their failing systems. Some eventually swallowed their pride and requested to join the new coalition, accepting terms they had initially rejected as humiliating. Others held firm to their refusal and watched their civilizations crumble as problems they could not solve alone multiplied beyond their ability to manage. Vethrak himself became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong under the old system. His own people turned against him as the Sarathan homeworlds. Infrastructure continued to fail despite his promises that they would find solutions without human help. He was removed from office in a vote that was not even close, and his replacement immediately began negotiations with humanity for assistance that should have been requested months earlier on a quiet evening after the worst of the crisis had passed. Malthus received an invitation to visit the human settlement that had been built beyond the borders of mapped space. He traveled there alone, wanting to see with his own eyes what humanity had created in their time of exile. What he found amazed him in ways he had not expected. The settlement was not the desperate refugee camp he had imagined when he learned that all of humanity had fled to a single location. Instead, it was a thriving community built with the same care and attention that humans had always brought to their work. a place of beauty and function that reflected the best qualities of the species who had constructed it. Kira Sujin met him at the landing pad and walked with him through streets where human children played alongside their parents who had finally found a home where they belonged. "You did not build this in the months since you left," Malthus observed as he studied the permanent structures that surrounded them. "No," Kira admitted. "We have been preparing this place for over a decade, ever since we realized that our time in galactic society was coming to an end one way or another. We hoped we would never need it. But we were not foolish enough to assume that hope alone would protect us from the inevitable." They walked in silence for a time before Malthus asked the question that had been burning in his mind since he first understood what humanity had done. "Do you regret leaving?" he asked, even though it caused so much suffering for innocent people who had done nothing wrong. Kira considered her answer carefully before responding. "I regret that leaving was necessary," she said. "I regret that generations of humans gave everything they had to a galaxy that could not see their value until they were gone. But I do not regret the choice itself, because staying would have meant accepting that we would never be seen as equals, and that was a price we were no longer willing to pay." She stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "The suffering that followed our departure was not caused by our absence. It was caused by a system that had been broken for a very long time and simply needed our presence to hide its flaws. Perhaps the galaxy needed to see how broken things truly were before it could begin to build something better." Malthus nodded slowly, understanding the truth in her words, even as he mourned the lives that had been lost in learning. Before he departed, he visited the engineering center where Park Jinho was training new workers from dozens of species who had come to learn from human expertise. Chelveth was there as well, working alongside her former mentor with a dedication that spoke of redemption and renewed purpose. "She came to us 3 months ago," Jinho explained when he noticed Malthus watching them. "She said she wanted to learn everything I could teach her so that she could go back and make sure no world ever suffers again, because knowledge was hoarded instead of shared. I told her that the learning goes both ways. She has taught me things about Sarth and engineering that I never understood before. That is how it should have been from the beginning," he added with a smile that held no bitterness, only hope for what could still be built together. Malthus returned to council space as the first non-human liaison to the new human cooperative, charged with ensuring that the old patterns of exploitation and neglect would never return. He spent the rest of his career working alongside humans and aliens alike, building bridges between species who had finally learned to see each other clearly. Years later, he attended a ceremony marking the 10th anniversary of the new partnership between humanity and a coalition of species who had chosen a different path. Kira Sujin, now an elder stateswoman whose wisdom had guided countless negotiations, stood before the assembled representatives and spoke words that would be remembered for generations. "You will miss us more than you know," she said, echoing the words she had spoken in the Great Hall so many years before. "That is what I told you when you drove us away, and it proved to be true in ways none of us could have imagined." She paused and looked out at the faces of 1,000 species who had learned to work together as genuine partners. "But now I say something different. You will never have to miss us again, because we have built something together that cannot be broken by fear or pride or the mistakes of those who came before. This is our home now, all of us together, and we will protect it with everything we have." The applause that followed was the sound of a galaxy that had finally found its way through the darkness, guided by hands that had always been willing to help if only they had been welcomed with open arms. And in the crowd, a human child held hands with an alien friend, neither one knowing or caring about the history that had almost kept them apart forever. The meeting aboard the small station lasted for 3 days as Kira Sujin and her fellow humans explained everything that had led to their departure from the galaxy they had helped to build. Malthus listened with growing understanding as the full picture emerged from stories and records and evidence that could not be denied or explained away. Humanity had not simply grown tired of being useful to ungrateful civilizations. They had reached a breaking point that had been building for generations beneath the surface of their smiling faces and willing hands. Every time a human engineer was passed over for promotion in favor of a less qualified member of the local species, the wound had deepened. Every time a human diplomat was excluded from important negotiations because their presence might offend delegates who found humans unsettling, the resentment had grown. Every time a human scientist made a breakthrough discovery only to see credit given to their non-human supervisors who had contributed nothing but their names, the hope for acceptance had dimmed. And every time a human child asked their parents why, the other species looked at them with fear and suspicion. Despite everything their family had done to help, a small part of their faith in the future had died. We told ourselves for generations that things would get better, Kira said on the second day of talks. We believed that if we just worked harder and proved ourselves more completely, eventually you would see us as we truly were. But Resolution 7789 showed us that no amount of service would ever change how you perceived the threat you imagined we posed to your established order. So we decided to stop trying to earn acceptance that would never come. And instead we chose to build something new for ourselves in a place where we could be free from the constant reminder that we were unwelcome guests in a civilization we had helped to create. Malthus struggled to find words that could adequately respond to the weight of what he had heard. I cannot speak for the entire council, he said finally, but I can tell you that what I have learned on this journey has changed my understanding of everything I thought I knew about humanity and our treatment of your kind. The question remains, Kira replied, whether understanding alone is enough to build a new foundation for our relationship, or whether it is simply another form of sympathy that will fade when the immediate crisis has passed and things return to normal. What would you need to believe that things could truly be different this time? Kira exchanged glances with her fellow humans before answering. We would need the council to formally acknowledge what happened, not as an apology designed to make themselves feel better, but as a genuine admission that the way humanity was treated was wrong and must never be repeated. We would need a new framework for human participation in galactic society, one where our contributions are recognized and valued openly rather than hidden away and taken for granted. We would need the right to leave freely if we ever feel that the old patterns are returning, without being labeled as traitors or threats for choosing to protect ourselves from further harm. And we would need to see these changes put into action, not just written on documents that will be forgotten as soon as the current crisis is resolved. Chelveth, who had remained silent throughout most of the meetings, finally spoke up with a trembling voice. Is Park Jinho here? She asked. I need to speak with him if he is willing to see me after everything I failed to do when he needed someone to stand beside him. Kira's expression softened as she looked at the young Sarthan engineer. Jinho is at our new settlement, helping to build the infrastructure that will allow our people to thrive in our new home, she said. But I can arrange for you to speak with him through a communication link if you wish. I would be grateful for that opportunity, Chelveth said, with tears forming in her golden eyes. I have so much to apologize for and so much to thank him for, and I was afraid I would never have the chance to say any of it. On the third day, Malthus made a decision that would define the rest of his life. I cannot promise that the council will accept your terms, he told Kira. There are still those who believe force is the answer, and there are others who will never admit they were wrong no matter how much evidence is placed before them. But I can promise you this. I will spend whatever time I have left fighting for the changes you have described, because I have seen the truth of what humanity means to our civilization, and I cannot unsee it now that my eyes have been opened. There are others in the delegation who feel as I do, and there are more back in council space who have watched their worlds crumble and now understand what they have lost. If enough of us stand together and speak with one voice, perhaps we can build the foundation you need to consider returning to the galaxy that should have been your home all along." Kira studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then we will wait," she said. "We will share the coordinates of our new settlement with those who accept our terms, and we will offer what help we can to those who are suffering through no fault of their own. But we will not return to a galaxy that has not changed, and we will not sacrifice our dignity again for the comfort of species who see us as nothing more than useful servants." The delegation departed the station with heavy hearts and a mission that seemed almost impossible to complete. Counselor Vethrak had sent messages during their absence demanding that they return immediately and report on humanity's military capabilities so that a proper invasion force could be assembled. Malethos deleted those messages without responding when they arrived back in council space. They found a galaxy that had continued to deteriorate in their absence. 3 more systems had failed completely, their populations forced to evacuate to overcrowded stations that were themselves running out of supplies. The war between the Kethvari and Moilani had expanded to include 2 additional species who had been drawn into the conflict through ancient alliances and modern grievances, and a new crisis had emerged on the Sarthan homeworld itself, where the main power grid had begun failing in ways that no one could understand or repair without the human engineers who had maintained it for decades. Vethrak stood before the council with desperation, barely hidden behind his angry words. "The humans have clearly sabotaged our infrastructure. As revenge for Resolution 7789, he declared. "This proves that we were right to exile them, and now we must respond with force to protect ourselves from further attacks." Malethos rose to challenge him with evidence that could not be ignored. "There is no sabotage," he said. "There are only systems that were maintained by humans for so long that no one else learned how they worked. And now those systems are failing because the people who understood them are gone. I have spoken with the humans directly, and they have offered to help us not because they owe us anything, but because they still care about the innocent people who are suffering through no fault of their own. But they will only return if we acknowledge what we did to them and commit to treating them as equals in a new framework of cooperation." The chamber erupted in arguments that lasted for hours as representatives from different species fought over what response was appropriate. Some sided with Vethrak, refusing to admit any wrongdoing. Others supported Malethos, recognizing that pride was a luxury they could no longer afford, and some simply sat in silence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the choice before them. When the session finally ended without resolution, Malethos returned to his quarters and found a message waiting from Kira Sujin. "We are monitoring your broadcasts." The message said, "We see that the council is divided, and we understand that change does not happen quickly in a civilization as old and complex as yours. But time is running out for many of your worlds, and we cannot wait forever for an answer that may never come. Some species have already reached out to us directly, bypassing the council entirely to accept our terms and request our assistance. Perhaps the path forward does not require unanimous agreement from those who will never change their minds. Perhaps it only requires enough voices speaking together to drown out those who would rather watch everything burn than admit they were wrong." Malethos read the message 3 times before understanding what Kira was suggesting. The council did not need to agree. Individual species could choose for themselves whether to accept humanity's terms and receive their help, and those who refused would be left to face the consequences of their pride alone. It was not the unified solution he had hoped for, but it was a path forward through the darkness that had seemed impassable only moments before he began drafting messages to every representative who had shown any willingness to listen. And he prayed that there would be enough of them to build something new from the ashes of what they had destroyed. The debate over how to respond to the human signal lasted 17 days while the galaxy continued to crumble around the council members, who could not agree on what words to speak across the void. Some demanded that humanity be ordered to return immediately and resume their positions as if nothing had happened and no apology was necessary for the exile that had driven them away. Others argued that the council should apologize formally and beg for forgiveness in exchange for whatever help the humans might be willing to provide to their former colleagues and neighbors. A smaller faction led by military commanders from the Sarthan Empire wanted to send warships to the signal source and force humanity to return whether they wanted to come back or not. Investigator Malthus listened to the arguments with growing frustration as precious time slipped away and more systems failed across known space with each passing day. He finally requested permission to speak after the 17th day of circular debates that went nowhere useful. Every approach you have discussed assumes that humanity owes us something, he said to the tired representatives who remained in the Great Hall. You speak of demands and orders and force, as if we have any power over a species that chose to leave rather than submit to our judgment. You speak of apologies as if words alone can undo generations of treatment that made them feel unwelcome in the very civilization they helped to build and maintain. Has it occurred to anyone in this chamber that perhaps the humans are asking us a genuine question and waiting for a genuine answer before they decide what comes next? Councillor Vethrak rose to respond with anger burning in his reptilian eyes. You suggest we humble ourselves before a species we have already determined to be a threat to galactic stability and peace, he said in a voice that trembled with barely contained rage. That would be an admission that Resolution 7789 was a mistake, and I will not accept such a verdict on my legacy. Your legacy, Malthus replied with cold precision, is a galaxy that is falling apart because you convinced everyone that removing humanity would solve problems that never existed in the first place. Your legacy is 10,000 dead in a war that should have been prevented by a human mediator who you drove away with your fear and your arrogance. Your legacy is children on a dozen worlds who will never receive medicine that human pharmacists knew how to make but never had the chance to teach others before they were forced to leave. The chamber fell silent as the weight of those words settled over every representative, like a blanket of shame that could not be thrown aside after a long moment of quiet reflection. A Vindari counselor named Sailthor rose to speak. I move that we send a small delegation to follow the signal and speak with the humans directly, she said in a calm voice that cut through the tension like a blade. Not to demand or threaten or beg, but to listen as they have asked us to do. Perhaps if we show them that we are capable of hearing their words without immediately dismissing them as we have done so many times before, they will be willing to tell us what they need from us in order to consider returning. The motion passed by a narrow margin, with Vethrak voting against it until the very end. Malthus was chosen to lead the delegation, and he selected a crew of 12 representing 8 different species, who had all lost something precious when the humans departed from their lives. Telvith, the Sarthan engineer, was among them. Determined to find her mentor Park Jinho and tell him everything she should have said when she had the chance to speak before the council. The ship they chose was old, but reliable, maintained by human engineers until 6 months ago and still functioning well enough to make the journey into unknown space. They followed the signal for 3 weeks through regions where no star charts existed and no navigation beacons marked the safe paths between gravitational hazards. Malthus spent the long hours of travel reading everything he could find about humanity's history with the Galactic Council. And the more he learned, the more ashamed he became of how his civilization had treated the strange beings from Earth. Humans had arrived in galactic society as newcomers with primitive technology and limited understanding of the complex political systems that governed interaction between species. Rather than waiting to be educated and accepted, they had immediately begun making themselves useful in whatever ways they could manage. They took jobs that other species considered beneath their dignity, maintaining systems and performing labor that was essential but unappreciated by those who benefited from it. They learned languages that no one else bothered to study and served as translators between species who had never spoken directly to each other before. They developed medicines for diseases that did not affect their own kind, simply because they saw suffering and wanted to help reduce it wherever they could. And in return for all of this, they had been treated as servants at best and threats at worst by the very civilizations they worked so hard to support. The signal led them to a small station orbiting a barren moon in a system that had no name on any chart Malthus could find. It was a simple structure, clearly human in design, with none of the ornate decorations that other species used to display their power and importance to visitors. A single ship was docked at the station, and a single voice responded when Malthus hailed them on standard communication frequencies. "We have been waiting for you," said woman whose voice he recognized from council records as Ambassador Kira Sujin. "Please dock and come aboard so we can speak face to face as equals should." When discussing matters of great importance, the delegation entered the station to find a small group of humans waiting for them in a meeting room that had been prepared with seats designed to accommodate the various body shapes of the species. Representative Kira Sujin stood at the head of the table with 5 other humans, whose faces Malthus did not recognize, but whose calm expression suggested they were prepared for whatever conversation was about to take place. Chelveth searched the room desperately for any sign of Park Jinho, but did not see him among those present. "Thank you for coming," Kira said as the delegation took their seats. "I know this journey was not easy, and I know that many in the council did not want you to make it at all. We came because we are ready to listen," Malthus replied, "as you asked us to do in your signal." Kira nodded slowly and sat down at the table across from him. "Then let me tell you why we left," she said, not as an accusation or a demand for sympathy, but as an explanation that you deserve to hear so you can understand what happened and why. "We did not leave because we hated you or wanted revenge for Resolution 7789. We left because staying had become impossible for us to bear any longer." She paused to gather her thoughts before continuing. "For generations, humans have given everything we had to galactic civilization, and we did so gladly because we believed we were building something together with species who saw us as partners in a great endeavor. But over time, we came to understand that we were not seen as partners at all. We were seen as useful tools that could be discarded when they became inconvenient or frightening to those who had grown comfortable with our service without ever acknowledging its value. Resolution 7789 was not the cause of our departure. It was simply the final confirmation of something we had known in our hearts for a very long time. You did not want us as equals, and we could not continue pretending that our contributions mattered to civilizations that saw us as lesser beings who existed only to serve their needs." Malthus felt the truth of her words like a blade, cutting through the comfortable lies he had told himself about how his civilization treated other species. What would it take, he asked carefully, for humanity to consider returning to the galaxy we shared together for so long? Kira looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only a deep and weary sadness that came from years of hoping for something that never arrived. "That depends entirely on you," she said, "and on whether the galaxy is truly ready to see us as something more than the invisible hands that kept everything running while receiving nothing but suspicion in return." The room fell silent as every member of the delegation confronted the question that would determine the future of 1,000 worlds and 1,000,000,000 lives waiting for an answer that might never come. The cascade began slowly at first, like water finding cracks in a great dam. But within 6 months of humanity's departure, the cracks had become rivers that threatened to wash away everything the Galactic Council had built over thousands of years. Investigator Malthus stood before a holographic display in his office that showed the current state of known space, and the red warning indicators that marked system failures had spread across the map like a disease that no medicine could cure. What had started as isolated incidents on distant worlds had become a pattern that even the most stubborn council members could no longer deny or explain away with comfortable lies. He pulled up his research files and began reviewing what his team had discovered about the true scope of human involvement in galactic civilization. And each new piece of information made the picture clearer and more terrifying at the same time. The humans had not conquered the galaxy with weapons or threats of violence, as so many species had feared they might eventually attempt to do. Instead, they had made themselves essential through the simple act of being genuinely helpful to anyone who needed assistance with problems large and small on the manufacturing world of Sorth Prime. The automated factories that produced starship components had ground to a halt because the quality control systems relied on calibration, techniques that human engineers had developed and maintained for 3 generations without ever writing them down in any official manual. The Sorthan workers, who had operated alongside their human colleagues for decades, suddenly realized they had no idea how the systems they used every day actually functioned beneath the surface. Medical stations across 12 sectors reported critical shortages of treatments for diseases that had been considered easily curable for centuries, because human pharmacists had quietly improved the standard formulas over time, and no one had bothered to record the changes they made. Communication networks that connected distant colonies to the galactic center began experiencing delays and failures as the ancient code that humans had maintained and patched for generations finally started to break down without their constant attention. Trade routes that had been safe and profitable for hundreds of years became dangerous overnight, because human navigators had been guiding ships through hazards that did not appear on any official chart. The knowledge had lived in their heads, passed down from mentor to student across generations, and now that knowledge had walked away with them into the unknown. Darkness beyond mapped space. Malthus interviewed dozens of aliens who had worked alongside humans in various capacities, and their stories painted a picture that made him ashamed of his own species and their role in passing. Resolution 7789. My human colleague warned me this would happen, said a Vendari communications technician who had worked at a relay station for 40 years. She told me again and again that we needed to document everything she knew, but I never had time to listen properly because there was always something more urgent demanding my attention. The council said humans were a threat to galactic stability, said a Kethvari merchant who had lost his entire shipping fleet to navigation errors in the first month after the Exodus. But the only instability I ever saw came from species who refused to work together until a human sat them down and made them talk to each other like reasonable beings. A young Sorathan engineer named Chelveth came to Malthus with tears in her large golden eyes and a story that broke his heart in ways he had not known it could still break. My mentor was a human named Park Jinho, she said in a voice that trembled with grief and guilt. He taught me everything I know about reactor maintenance and safety protocols and creative problem solving. When the standard solutions failed to work, she paused to compose herself before continuing with her painful confession. When the council began debating Resolution 7789, he begged me to speak against it at the public hearings where citizens could voice their concerns about the proposed action against humanity. He said that if I explained how much we depended on human expertise, the Council might reconsider their decision before it was too late to change course. But I was afraid. Shelveth admitted with shame burning in her eyes. I was afraid that defending humans would hurt my career and make others see me as a sympathizer with a dangerous species. So I stayed silent when my voice might have made a difference. Now Jinho is gone somewhere I cannot follow. And every day I discover another thing he taught me that I never fully appreciated until I had to do it alone without his guidance. Malthus added her testimony to the growing file of evidence that documented how thoroughly humanity had woven themselves into the fabric of galactic civilization. But the most disturbing discovery came when his team uncovered records showing that humans had spent a decade before their departure actively trying to prevent this exact catastrophe from occurring. They'd offered to train replacements for every critical position they held across known space, creating detailed documentation and educational programs that would allow other species to take over their responsibilities if needed. Almost no one had accepted the training. The programs had been dismissed as unnecessary because everyone assumed humans would always be there to handle the work that no one else wanted to do. The documentation had been filed away in archives that no one bothered to access because it was easier to simply ask a human for help than to learn how to solve problems independently. They saw this coming. Malthus said to himself as he stared at the records of rejected training programs and ignored warnings. They knew exactly what would happen, and they tried to prepare us, but we were too arrogant and too comfortable to listen to their words of caution. The Council finally agreed to hold an emergency session after the war between the Kethvari and Molani claimed its 10,000th casualty in a conflict that should never have happened in the first place. Councillor Vethrak still refused to admit any responsibility for the crisis, insisting that the failures were temporary setbacks that would resolve themselves once the galaxy adjusted to the absence of human interference in their affairs. We survived before the humans came, he argued from the same podium where he had celebrated their exile. We will survive now that they are gone, and we will be stronger for having freed ourselves from dependence on a species that could not be trusted. But his words rang hollow in a chamber where half the seats sat empty because representatives could not travel safely through space lanes that humans know. Longer maintained Malthus was granted permission to address the Council, and he presented his findings with the cold precision of an investigator who had seen too much to spare anyone's feelings anymore. Humanity did not infiltrate our civilization, he said. They did not scheme to make themselves necessary or plan to hold us hostage to their expertise and labor. They simply saw work that needed doing and did it without complaint or demand for recognition. They filled the gaps that we pretended did not exist because acknowledging those gaps would mean admitting we were not as advanced or self-sufficient as we wanted to believe. And now those gaps have become chasms that threaten to swallow everything we have built together over millennia of cooperation and conflict and growth. He paused to let his words sink in before delivering the news that would change everything. 3 days ago, my team detected a faint signal coming from beyond the borders of mapped space in a region where no ship has traveled in recorded history. The signal is human in origin, and it is broadcasting a single question on repeat across all frequencies we can detect. The Great Hall fell silent as Malthus played the recording for every representative who remained in their seats. A human voice, calm and clear, spoke words that carried the weight of everything that had been lost. Are you ready to listen now? Or do you need more time to understand what you have done to yourselves and to the future you thought you were building without? Yes, by your side. The question hung in the air like a judgment that no one could escape. And for the first time since Resolution 7789 had passed, Councillor Vethrak had nothing to say in his own defense. The signal continued broadcasting into the void, patient and steady, waiting for an answer that the Galactic Council was not yet ready to give. The Great Hall of the Galactic Council had never seen such celebration before this day, and the 1,000 representatives from across known space raised their voices in triumph as the final vote was counted on the massive display screens that hung above their heads like glowing moons. Resolution 7789 had passed with an overwhelming majority, and humanity was now officially cut off from all galactic trade, communication, and political participation effective immediately. Councillor Vethrak of the Sorthan Empire stood at the central podium with his forearms spread wide in victory, his scaled face twisted into what his species considered a smile as he addressed the cheering crowd that surrounded him on all sides. Today we have freed ourselves from the chaos that humanity brought to our orderly galaxy, he declared in a voice that echoed through the ancient chamber. No longer will we tolerate their unpredictable nature, their refusal to follow established protocols, and their constant meddling in affairs that do not concern them. The applause grew louder, and species that had argued for centuries found common ground in their shared distrust of the strange beings from the small blue world called Earth in the back of the hall. Standing alone in the section reserved for human delegates, Ambassador Kira Sujin watched the celebration with calm eyes that betrayed no emotion whatsoever. She was a small woman with black hair pulled back in a simple style, and she wore the formal gray uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps with quiet dignity. Despite the hostile stares directed at her from every corner of the room when the celebration finally died down enough for other voices to be heard, Kira walked slowly toward the central podium, and the crowd parted before her like water around a stone. The human representative wishes to make a final statement, announced the automated system that managed speaking privileges, and a hush fell over the assembly as every eye turned toward the lone human in their midst. Kira climbed the steps to the podium and stood where Vethrak had stood moments before, and she looked out at the faces of 1,000 species who had just voted to exile her kind from the galaxy they had helped build. "I will not beg," she said in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the massive hall. "I will not threaten, and I will not warn you of consequences you have already chosen to ignore." She paused and let her gaze sweep across the assembly one final time. "I will only say this. You will miss us more than you know." With those words, she placed a small data chip on the podium, turned, and walked out of the great hall without looking back, even once the doors closed behind her with a sound like a tomb being sealed. And Councillor Vethrak laughed as he picked up the data chip she had left behind. "Human arrogance until the very end," he said to the amusement of those around him. "Let them sulk in their exile while the rest of us move forward into a brighter future." The celebration continued long into the night cycle, and no one noticed when every human ship in Council space quietly departed for the outer reaches of known territory within one standard galactic month. The silence began. It started with small things that no one connected at first, like the agricultural world of Keth Prime reporting that their automated terraforming equipment had stopped functioning for reasons their technicians could not understand. The repair protocols had been written by human engineers decades ago, and no one else had ever bothered to learn how the complex systems actually worked beneath their simple interfaces. Then the medical station orbiting Vindari 6 sent an urgent message stating that they had run out of a critical pharmaceutical compound that only human chemists knew how to synthesize properly. The formula existed in their databases, but every attempt to replicate it produced a useless substance that helped no one at all. Communication relays in the outer territories began failing one by one, and the technicians who investigated discovered that humans had been maintaining these ancient systems through methods that existed nowhere in any official manual or guide. Trade ships found themselves lost in regions of space they had traveled safely for generations, because the human navigators who had memorized the safe passages through gravitational anomalies were no longer there to guide them through the dangers that lurked in the darkness between stars. Investigator Malthus of the Vendari Security Division received his assignment on the morning that the third major system failure was reported to the Council. He was a tall being with silver skin and large eyes that could see across multiple spectrums of light. And he had built his reputation on solving problems that others considered impossible to understand. Find out what happened to the humans. His superiors ordered him. Determine if this is an attack, a coordinated effort to sabotage our infrastructure, or something else entirely that we have not yet considered. Malthus began his investigation by reviewing the departure records of every human vessel that had left Council space in the month following Resolution 7789. What he found disturbed him deeply in ways he could not fully explain. There was no panic in the records, no desperate flight from persecution or exile, no signs of the chaos that usually accompanied a mass exodus of any species from their established territories. Instead, he found calm and orderly departures, scheduled transports leaving on time, and human citizens quietly closing their businesses, saying goodbye to colleagues and friends, and walking away from lives they had built over generations. It was as if they had been preparing for this moment for years, waiting patiently for the confirmation they seemed to know would eventually come. The data chip that Ambassador Kira Sujin had left behind was finally decrypted after weeks of effort by the Council's best codebreakers. And Malthus was present when its contents were revealed. There were no threats inside the chip, no demands for justice or revenge, no warnings of destruction to come. There was only a simple message written in clear text that anyone could read. We tried to tell you, but you would not listen to our words. So now we will show you instead what we meant when we said you needed us more than you believed. We were the thread holding the tapestry together. And now that thread has been pulled free by your own hands. Watch carefully as everything unravels. And remember that we offered to stay if only you had asked us with kindness instead of pushing us away with fear. Malthus read the message 3 times before he understood what it truly meant. And a cold feeling settled in his chest as he realized the scope of what the Council had done. 3 months after the silence began, the Kethvari Dominion declared war on the Morlani Federation over a border dispute that had been settled peacefully 200 years ago. The treaty that had maintained peace between them had been negotiated by human diplomats, and the human mediator who had spent her entire career keeping both sides talking had departed with all the others when Resolution 7789 had passed without her steady presence and her ability to find common ground between species who saw the universe in completely different ways. Old hatreds resurfaced like wounds that had never truly healed beneath their bandages. The first shots were fired on a Tuesday by Galactic Standard Time, and Malthus watched the reports come in with growing horror as he understood that this was only the beginning of sorrows yet to come. He sent an urgent message to the Council requesting an emergency session to discuss what he had learned, and he attached a single question that he hoped would shake them from their celebration long enough to see the truth. We removed humanity from our galaxy because we believed they were dangerous and unnecessary, he wrote. But what if we were wrong about everything we thought we knew about them and about ourselves as well? The message went unanswered for 3 days, and in that time, 2 more systems failed, and another ancient conflict reignited in the darkness of space, where human peacekeepers no longer walked among the stars.